Nurses who think battlefield triage translates to actual medical judgment are a danger to patient care. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 48 minutes before the Pentagon arrived at Cedar Creek Medical. Natalie Hayes moved through the ICU with the precision of someone who had learned to disappear. Her surgical cap pulled low. Her badge clipped to the lanyard at her collar, the kind of small detail nobody notices. She checked the monitors with the efficiency of a woman whose hands had learned their own language long ago, each movement economical, each gesture placing her slightly outside the frame of attention. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that only hospital staff ever really hear, a low electronic drone that becomes white noise after enough 12-hour shifts. The air smelled sharp with antiseptic, that chemical bite of chlorhexidine and isopropyl alcohol that never quite leaves your clothes. She stopped at the bedside of Captain Marcus Reeves. The morning sun cut through the corner window in a sharp angle, catching the dust particles suspended in the air like tiny satellites orbiting nothing. Reeves' monitor beeped its steady rhythm, sinus rhythm, perfectly normal, and she allowed herself to check the waveform with the kind of clinical detachment that had kept her alive through 3 rotations in Fallujah and 2 in Helmand Province. His sternotomy incision from yesterday's cardiac bypass surgery was healing cleanly. The sutures were precise, evenly spaced, the kind of work that suggested the surgeon at least knew which end of a knife was sharp. Natalie adjusted his flow rate with 2 fingers, feeling the tiny resistance of the roller clamp as it caught, then released. Muscle memory. Her hands moved the way they always did, without thinking, because thinking sometimes got people killed. That was when she saw it. Captain Marcus Reeves' exposed forearm. The tattoo. Bold black letters, impossible to miss, Hayes. She stared at it for exactly 3 seconds. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly, so slight that only someone trained to read the absence of expression would notice it. 7 years ago, Fallujah, Jolan District. A burning Humvee, smoke so thick you couldn't see the hand in front of your face, and a young lieutenant choking on his own blood with both legs pinned under twisted metal. She had been Master Chief Petty Officer then. Before the records were erased. Before her name stopped appearing in official reports. Before Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes simply ceased to exist in any database that mattered. She had pulled him out. Had carried him 600 meters through hostile fire with rounds passing so close she could hear them whisper past her ear like angry hornets. Had kept him breathing with her own hands when his lungs had given up. He'd gotten her name tattooed so he would never forget. And now he was looking right through her every morning without a flicker of recognition. Natalie adjusted his oxygen saturation monitor, already reading 96% good, and moved to the next patient without waiting to see if he would acknowledge her. He wouldn't. Nobody did. That was the entire point. She was the kind of person people look past, the way you look past fluorescent lights or the hum of a ventilator. Competent. Present. Invisible. It was a skill she had cultivated carefully, the same way a sniper cultivates patience. The way you become part of the environment so completely that people stop registering your presence as anything remarkable. In the break room that evening, she opened her locker. The pair of worn combat boots sat on the bottom shelf, partially hidden behind her spare shoes. The leather was cracked from desert sun, the soles worn down in the pattern of someone who had spent 847 days standing watch, she had counted. Faded boot camp stencil on the heel, U.S. Navy, size 7. She reached down and touched the worn fabric of the left boot briefly, just her fingertips, the way you might touch a grave marker. The leather was still slightly stiff in places where dried blood had once soaked through. She had cleaned them 3 times. The stains had never entirely come out. Then she closed the door, securing the hinges with a soft click that sounded like a lock closing on the person she used to be. A surgical resident stood at the sink, washing his hands for his shift. Dr. Michaels, competent, arrogant, the kind of young doctor who had never made a mistake that cost him anything. He glanced over at her as she passed, and his eyes dropped automatically to her forearms. The scars were there, thin white lines running parallel to her tendons like tracks, visible when the light caught them right. Shrapnel from an IED outside Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. The medic, her subordinate at the time, had dug out the pieces with tweezers while she sat upright, because lying down meant the breathing became harder. Pain is data, she had told him. Just data. He had nodded and kept digging. Michaels looked away quickly. Most people did when they caught sight of those scars. There was something in the pattern of them that registered wrong to the civilian eye, something that spoke to trauma in a language only people who had seen actual combat understood. It was easier to not see them. To not see her. Natalie clocked in for the evening shift at 18:47 hours, 19 minutes before the end of day's shift, giving her enough time to catch the handoff from the outgoing charge nurse. The unit was running at 94% capacity, 8 critical patients, 2 pending transfers. Standard for a Tuesday. She took her assignments without protest, 3 ICU patients, one of them Captain Reeves. The other nurse, Santos, gave her the overnight briefing with the efficiency of someone who had worked alongside her for 4 years without ever really asking questions. Reeves' ejection fraction is climbing, Santos said, pointing at the cardiac monitor. 55% yesterday, 58 this morning. Surgeons pleased. He's talking about stepping down to a regular floor bed by end of week if the numbers hold. Natalie nodded. And there's something off about his blood cultures, Santos continued. Waiting on the gram stain results. Probably nothing, but flag me if his temperature spikes again. Understood, Natalie said. Maximum 3 words. She had learned that brevity was one of the best invisibility tools. People forget people who don't say much. They remember the ones who talk. The afternoon shift was transitioning out when Dr. Caldwell entered the ICU for grand rounds. She heard him before she saw him. The way his voice preceded him, crisp and commanding like someone who had never experienced the simple humility of being wrong. Natalie was charting at the medication card, her hand steady despite the way her pulse had quickened slightly, not from fear but from a tactical assessment that something was about to change the pressure in the room. Caldwell walked toward the beds with the chief of medicine trailing just slightly behind, the way a remora fish follows a shark. The residents scattered like startled birds, suddenly very interested in the nearest monitor screen. She kept charting. Caldwell stopped at the foot of Captain Reeves' bed and scanned the chart. His eyes moved with the mechanical precision of someone reading data without truly seeing it. Then his gaze shifted to Natalie, and she felt the weight of his attention like a hand pressing down on her shoulder. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who had decided beforehand that the conversation would be brief and conclusive. A moment. She closed the chart and turned to face him, her posture perfect, her face arranged in the expression of neutral professional attentiveness that had become as much a part of her uniform as her badge. Around them, the ICU suddenly seemed to develop a heightened level of interest in their own work. The background noise of monitors and ventilators seemed to drop imperceptibly, as if the unit itself was leaning in to listen. "The residents were discussing your charting notes from this morning," Caldwell said, his eyes moving briefly to the chief before settling back on Natalie. "Your assessment of post-operative cardiac function showed some rather creative interpretation of the clinical data. Specifically, your suggestion that we should increase monitoring frequency for potential complications." He paused. In that pause, Natalie understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't a question. This was a performance. "Battlefield triage," Caldwell continued, his voice rising slightly, not with anger, but with pedagogical certainty, the tone of someone explaining a simple concept to someone slow to understand. "It translates to rapid field stabilization under fire. Nothing more. Nurses who think this experience somehow qualifies them to make independent clinical judgments in a civilian hospital setting are, quite frankly, a danger to patient care. And to the credibility of this institution." The residents smirked. Not openly. Just the corner of their mouths, a slight upward curve that they quickly suppressed when they saw that Natalie's eyes had registered it. The chief of medicine said nothing. Natalie's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Her hand, still holding the medication cart, did not tremor. Her breathing did not change. The nurses around her had stopped moving entirely, Santos frozen mid-step, her eyes carefully averted, the respiratory therapist suddenly very interested in checking a ventilator that didn't need checking. The monitor above Captain Reeves' head continued its steady beep. His sinus rhythm was perfect. My charting reflects current vital signs and trending data, Natalie said quietly. Her voice was pitched at exactly the right level. The words hung in the air like a challenge that nobody in the unit was willing to acknowledge. Natalie's posture didn't change. Her expression didn't change. She simply nodded once, a small incline of her head that could have meant agreement, could have meant understanding, could have meant nothing at all. She returned to the medication cart and opened the drawer with her right hand, retrieving the next patient's evening medications with the same precision she would use to field strip a rifle. Behind her, she heard Caldwell explaining to the chief that credentialing standards had been relaxed too much in recent years, that nurses from non-traditional backgrounds brought valuable diversity but not necessarily optimal clinical judgment, that perhaps they should review her file more carefully. The words washed over her like water over stone, not absorbed, not internalized, simply allowing their intended damage to deflect around something hard and patient beneath the surface. Santos approached her quietly at the medication cart. "That was bullshit," Santos whispered. Natalie didn't look at her. She drew up the medications for her next patient with the steady hand that came from having done this 10,000 times before. 10,000 times in a combat hospital with sand blowing through the walls. 10,000 times with patients who would have died in the first 60 seconds if the decisions had been made by someone without the kind of judgment that came from holding a man's life together with your own hands while rounds impacted the sandbags behind you. "I'm going on break," Natalie said. It wasn't true. She had just started her shift. But it was the kind of statement that Santos would understand, that everyone in the unit would understand. It meant, "I'm fine. I can handle this. I'm not broken by his words." And she walked toward the break room before anyone could see the way her hand, finally alone, trembled slightly as she released the pen she'd been holding. The door clicked shut behind her. In the break room, she leaned against the counter with her eyes closed for exactly 45 seconds. Long enough to regulate her breathing. Long enough to remind herself of three things: her name, her rank, a Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, and the fact that Dr. Caldwell had no idea who he was speaking to. That Captain Reeves had no idea that the woman changing his 4 bags had carried him through hostile fire. That the entire hospital full of residents and attendings would continue to look right through her, day after day, night after night, unless something forced them to see. She opened her eyes, checked her reflection in the small mirror above the sink, and stepped back out into the ICU. 48 minutes later, everything would change. But first, there was a patient who needed his medications, a monitor that needed to be checked, a night shift that needed to be worked with the kind of quiet precision that had kept her alive through 7 years of trying to disappear. The vending machine hummed its fluorescent drone in the break room corridor, 2:13 in the afternoon, the dead hour between lunch rounds and evening medication passes. Natalie reached for her ID badge to swipe through the break room door when a voice stopped her cold. "Hayes." Dr. Caldwell stood before the vending machine's glowing rectangle, already feeding coins into the slot with the casual authority of a man who'd never had to think about money. His dress shirt was crisp, his tie silk. He didn't turn to face her directly, that would have been too obvious, too aggressive. Instead, he positioned himself at an angle, blocking the machine slightly, forcing her to acknowledge him or retreat. A small power play. The kind that worked on most people. Natalie kept her breathing even. She'd learned control in desert heat at 140 degrees with a rifle in her hands and people screaming. She could handle a vending machine corridor at 2:33 p.m. "Coffee?" Caldwell continued, still not looking at her directly. His tone was conversational, almost friendly. "Almost. They say it's terrible for you. But we all have our crutches, don't we?" He punched in his selection, B3, and a can tumbled down with a metallic crash. She said nothing. Moved a step past him. He shifted slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to make her pause. His presence had a density to it, like standing too close to someone who was deliberately making you uncomfortable. She could smell his coffee breath now, that bitter acidic warmth mixed with expensive cologne. The smell of a man who'd never questioned whether he belonged in any room. "I've been meaning to talk to you," Caldwell said, finally turning to face her. His smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "About your future here at Cedar Creek. I think, and I say this with genuine concern, I think you might be more comfortable working somewhere else. There are excellent VA clinics in the San Diego area where standards are more flexible. Places that value, shall we say, unconventional approaches to patient care." The words landed like small stones. Flexible. Unconventional. Code for, you don't belong here. Natalie's jaw tightened once, a single muscle spasm she couldn't quite suppress, but her hands remained steady. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and withdrew 4 quarters and 2 dimes, exact change. 6 coins. She did not fumble. Did not search for bills. Did not show even the smallest sign of the hammering in her chest. "I'm reviewing staffing allocations with my old fraternity brother on the hospital board next week," Caldwell continued, and now there was something sharper in his voice. "A knife wrapped in velvet. Outstanding fellow. Rhodes Scholar, Harvard Medical School, married to a federal judge. The kind of person who pays attention when someone flags concerns about employee judgment. Just thought you should know." He inserted his own coins, clink, 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 each one deliberate, marked. Natalie pressed B7 for a protein bar. The machine whirred. The bar dropped. She retrieved it with the same mechanical precision she'd used to insert an 4-line, no hesitation, no tremor. The bar was cool in her hand, wrapped in silver foil. She turned and walked away from the vending machine without meeting Caldwell's eyes, without acknowledging his words, without giving him the smallest reaction he was fishing for. Her footsteps were quiet on the linoleum. Professional. Composed. The kind of walk that said, "You're not worth my voice." Behind her, she heard Caldwell's dry laugh, a sound like paper tearing. He was satisfied. He thought he'd won something. But that wasn't the worst part. Natalie returned to the ICU, to Captain Reeves' bedside where the monitors beeped their steady rhythm and the evening light slanted through the windows at that particular San Diego angle, golden and deceptive, as if the world were still a place where things made sense. She pulled up his chart on the computer terminal and began her evening documentation. Vital stable. Incision healing. No complications. Her typing was precise, her notes clinically clean. Any observer would have seen a nurse doing her job with competent professionalism. No one would have noticed that her breathing had changed. That her heart rate was elevated at a level she could feel against her ribs. That the words on the screen were taking longer to appear because her peripheral vision had narrowed slightly, focusing on threat assessment, exit routes, the position of the nearest emergency supplies. No one would have seen the tremor in her hand when she reached for the medication cart at 3:12 p.m. to pull Captain Reeves' evening heparin drip, a tremor she caught instantly, controlled, concealed. But it was there. A small crack in the foundation. She stood alone in the medication room for 7 seconds, staring at the syringe in her hand. The medication cart hummed its quiet electric hum. Fluorescent panels overhead cast everything in that sterile brightwash that made shadows impossible. Caldwell didn't know who he was standing next to. That was the paradox that had become her entire existence, the safety of invisibility purchased at the price of watching people underestimate you, dismiss you, treat you as if your experience counted for nothing. 7 years. That's how long she'd been hiding inside the role of just a nurse while the man in the expensive shirt decided she wasn't adequate for his institution. What he didn't know was that the woman he'd just threatened had once held a perimeter alone for 4 hours while Hellfire missiles painted the sky above Tikrit. What he didn't know was that her hands, the ones now trembling slightly over a syringe, had performed an emergency cricothyrotomy in a burning Humvee with a pocket knife and a Bic pen. What he didn't know was that Captain Marcus Reeves walking the ICU halls in cardiac rehab had her name tattooed on his forearm because she'd carried him and 2 other Marines 6 miles through hostile fire. She set the syringe down on the stainless steel counter. Took a breath. Counted to 4. The tremor stopped. She picked the syringe back up, her hand steady now, the hesitation absorbed and filed away where it belonged. She moved back into the ICU proper, back to Captain Reeves' room, back to the work that required her to be invisible and competent in equal measure. At 4:15 p.m., in his office overlooking the San Diego skyline, Dr. Caldwell made his first call. To the board chairman, Thomas Sterling, a man who owed him a favor from a departmental grant 3 years prior. "We need to discuss credentialing issues," Caldwell said into his phone, his voice smooth as machinery. "Specifically a nurse on my ICU team who's been performing high-risk procedures without proper supervision. I'm concerned about liability exposure." At 4:31 p.m., he made his second call. To Naval Medical Center San Diego, speaking to a records administrator he'd met at a conference. "Employee verification check," he said. "Natalie Hayes. Former military background per her application. I just need to confirm her service dates and final rank." The pause that came back over the line was long. Too long. "We're showing gaps in her file," the administrator said carefully. "Large gaps. And some records are flagged at a level that doesn't appear standard." Caldwell leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "How large?" "I can't discuss specifics over the phone, doctor. But if she listed her service dates on hospital paperwork, you might want to verify them independently." At 4:53 p.m., he made his third call. To a private investigator named Marcus Webb, a man who operated in the gray spaces between public records and information brokers. "I need a full background investigation on a Cedar Creek medical employee. Name, dates of service, family history, financial records, anything you can find." Caldwell read off Natalie's information, her social security number, her address. "I'm paying premium rates for speed. I want it by Thursday." Webb's voice came back calm and professional. "That's 3 days, document." "I'm aware. You expecting to find something specific?" Caldwell smiled, looking out at the city stretching beneath the hospital windows. The beach's gold in the fading afternoon light. The harbor beyond, where Navy ships came and went like ghosts. "I'm expecting to find exactly what I need to remove her from payroll by Friday." In the ICU, Natalie checked the 4 line on Captain Reeves' arm. The site was clean, the dressing intact, the medication running clear and constant. She adjusted the flow rate by 1 milliliter per hour, a minor modification based on what the current fluid status required. The kind of clinical decision that came from experience, from years of reading the smallest signs in how a body responded to intervention. He was still sleeping, his breathing synchronized with the ventilator's mechanical rhythm. His chart showed his hearing was scheduled for next Thursday at Naval Station San Diego, a procurement fraud case where he was the key witness. 7 days away. 7 days where the monitors would continue their constant conversation and Natalie would continue moving through the ICU like a ghost, seen but not observed, present but not counted. She didn't know yet that the clock was counting down to something far worse than institutional dismissal. She didn't know that the man in the expensive shirt had just set in motion the machinery that would threaten everything she'd built in the careful architecture of her disappearance. She only knew that her hand had trembled, and that Caldwell had heard the silence between the words he'd spoken, and that somewhere in the gap between his threat and her restraint, the real danger was already taking shape. The evening shift continued. Medications delivered. Vitals recorded. The machinery of a hospital moving forward in its endless rotation, indifferent to the small wars being fought in corridors and break rooms and doctors' offices, where the quiet ones learn to absorb the blows and keep walking. Somewhere in the building above the ICU, a fax machine began receiving pages from Naval Medical Center records. Somewhere else, Marcus Webb opened a new file on his computer and began typing a name into a dozen different databases. And in the medication room, where the fluorescent lights cast their shadowless white glow, the protein bar sat unopened on the counter where Natalie had set it down. She'd never gotten around to eating it. The ICU at 0200 hours exists in a kind of suspended silence. The world outside the walls doesn't exist here. Only the monitors. Only the rhythmic wheeze of ventilators and the soft beep of oxygen saturation numbers climbing and falling like tides. Natalie moved through the rows of beds with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that economy of motion was its own form of strength. Her scrubs were fresh, her badge clipped to her chest, her combat boots, the ones at the bottom of her locker, worn now from Tikrit dust that would never completely wash out, replaced with regulation hospital Crocs that made no sound on the linoleum. She was checking the lines on a septic patient 3 beds down when the monitor above Captain Reeves' head began its climb into chaos. The alarm wasn't loud. Alarms in good hospitals never are. They're designed to alert without triggering panic, a civilized escalation. But Natalie heard it the way a predator hears a branch crack at 200 meters, information, context, threat assessment all compressed into the microsecond between sound and understanding. His sternotomy incision was bleeding. Internal bleed, the kind that doesn't show on the surface until the patient's already lost half his blood volume. 47 hours post-surgery and his own healing tissue was coming apart at the seams. She moved. Not ran. Ran looked panicked. Moved looked controlled. The distance from the septic bed to Reeves' bedside was 14 feet, she covered it in 3 seconds, her eyes already cataloguing what she'd need, the crash cart within arm's reach, the defibrillator pad still on his chest, the central line still patent, the blood products already hanging because a good ICU nurse always anticipated the next problem before it announced itself. The resident on call, a nervous kid named Patterson who was still learning to trust his instincts, was reaching for the phone to call the attending. Natalie was already opening the sterile kit. "We need the attending now," Patterson said, his voice climbing. "We need to get him back to OR, we need." "He's coding." Her voice was flat, factual, the voice of someone reading a grocery list. "We don't have time for that conversation." The first incision was already there, still sutured, still pink at the edges from fresh healing. She'd done this before, open cardiac massage, direct hand compression of the ventricles when the chest cavity was already compromised. Battlefield medicine. The kind of procedure that lived in exactly 3 places: combat zones, medical school simulations, and nightmares. She cracked his ribs open with her hands, felt the familiar give of the sternum, the moment of resistance before the body surrenders to physics. Patterson made a sound like a cat caught in a screen door. "I said step back," Natalie said quietly, and Patterson stepped back. Her right hand found the heart, surprisingly small, surprisingly warm, surprisingly still capable of betrayal even after a skilled surgeon had already opened it once. She began compressions, direct hand to ventricle, feeling for the resistance that meant she was generating pressure, that she was forcing blood to where it needed to go. Her movements were mechanical, precise, the kind of rhythm you only maintained when your nervous system had learned to separate from your spine. 1, 2, 3. The chambers squeezed under her palm like a small, desperate animal. Reeves' blood ran warm across her hand, across her forearm, across the cuff of her scrub jacket. It smelled like copper and failure and the particular metallic sweetness of someone bleeding from the inside out. The doors burst open with the sound of breaking glass, except there was no glass breaking. There was just the sound of automatic weapons fire entering a sterile environment and finding targets that had nothing to do with saving lives. The masked figures came through in a formation Natalie recognized: tactical entry, 2-person stack, weapons up, muzzle discipline suggesting training. Professional. The first shots came in rapid sequence, the sound like a carpenter's nail gun in a tile echo chamber. A monitor exploded in a spray of sparks and plastic. The 4-pole beside Reeves' bed developed 3 holes in succession. A nurse at the far end screamed, the kind of scream that contains both fear and the betrayal of realizing that hospitals, which were supposed to be sanctuaries, were apparently not sanctuaries at all. Natalie didn't stop compressing. She couldn't stop compressing. You don't pause a cardiac massage because someone is shooting at you any more than you pause your own breathing because the house is on fire. Her body understood the calculus: Reeves would die if her hand stopped. The bullets were secondary. Everything was secondary. The first round caught her in the left shoulder, high, entry wound clean and exit wound that felt like being hit with a sledgehammer made of ice and electricity. Her shoulder blade absorbed most of the impact, but the round still tunneled through muscle and tissue before exiting at an angle that left her arm suddenly operating at half capacity. There was no pain yet. Pain is a luxury the nervous system only offers when you have time to process information. Right now she had compressions. She had rhythm. She had one functional arm and a patient whose heart was in her hand. She threw her body over Reeves, using her own frame as a barrier between his open chest cavity and the trajectory of the second volley. The second round came in fast, a ricochet off the steel head of the hospital bed that sent it sideways through her ribs with the sound of tearing fabric and something deeper, something that felt like her body learning for the first time what a bullet actually feels like inside muscle tissue. Her blood mixed with his on the sterile field, both of them running together now into the same pool of red, impossible to separate which blood belonged to whom. "Lock down!" She screamed it like a command, like an order given by someone whose right to give orders was written in bone and scar tissue. "Lock down, now!" Her right hand never stopped moving. Not once. Left arm hanging useless, ribs on fire, her vision beginning to narrow at the edges the way it did when blood loss reached a certain percentage, and still her hand pumped his heart. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm was iron. The rhythm was the only thing in this room that had not been compromised by violence, and she would maintain it or she would die maintaining it. Those were the only two options available to her nervous system. Security came through the doors like they'd been waiting for permission. 2 officers, one of whom she recognized, Mitchell, who'd served 2 tours in Fallujah before taking civilian work, and Mitchell didn't hesitate. He moved toward the shooters with the kind of economical violence that came from muscle memory, from understanding that hesitation was the thing that got people killed. The second officer flanked, and it was over in 40 seconds. Weapons down. Subject subdued. The fluorescent lights reflected off the barrel of a 9mm pistol as it came to rest on the tile floor. The surgical team arrived in the way surgical teams always arrive at true emergencies. They materialized, as if they'd been standing just outside the door waiting for their cue. 3 of them, moving with the choreography of people who had spent thousands of hours in operating rooms. The attending surgeon, a woman named Reeves Chen, no relation to the patient, a fact that had always struck Natalie as cosmically funny, took one look at the open chest, at the direct manual massage, at Natalie's arm hanging useless, and made a decision that was both merciful and necessary. "We're taking over," she said, and her hands moved into position, and Natalie's hands were gently, firmly removed from the patient's chest cavity. They transferred the compression to the surgical instruments in the way you do when you've been trained to do exactly this thing. The Reboa catheter went in. The rapid infuser hummed. Reeves was already moving toward the operating room, already being lifted onto a stretcher that had materialized like the surgical team, already transitioning from emergency resuscitation to definitive surgical care. Natalie was pulled backward by 2 nurses whose names she couldn't quite remember through the expanding cloud of pain and blood loss that was finally allowed to announce itself. "Let's get you to the ER," one of them said. "You're bleeding." She looked down at her scrubs. Looked at her ribs, where the second round had left a wound that was beginning to understand itself, that was beginning to send signals to her brain about the violation that had just occurred. Her left arm was useless. That was fine. She was right-hand anyway. She'd fought with worse. She'd bled more. She'd had less reason to get up afterward. They wheeled her to surgery, and Natalie watched the ceiling tiles pass overhead, each one a small white rectangle containing the universe. She thought about her daughter Emma, at home with Mrs. Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, but Cedar Creek Medical was like that, a small city of interconnected lives. She thought about the job that had finally let her disappear into something resembling a normal life. She thought about how fragile that had turned out to be. How one moment of not disappearing fast enough was about to change everything. In the waiting area, or rather, in the administrator's office where the real waiting happened, Dr. Caldwell was presenting a folder thick as a medical textbook to the chief operating officer, a man named Gerald Morrison whose face had gone white when security informed him there had been an active shooter in the ICU. 2 of them. Subdued. No additional casualties beyond the one nurse who'd taken rounds while shielding the patient. Caldwell had been waiting for this moment. Not the shooting, he'd wanted her removed before the shooting, obviously. But the shooting was better than he could have planned. The shooting was gift-wrapped justification. Cowboy heroics, Caldwell said, his voice smooth as surgical sutures. Protocol violations. Unsupervised high-risk procedures. This incident proves everything I've documented. He'd been building the case for 3 weeks. The investigator he'd hired, a man named Burgess who'd worked for insurance companies and understood how to make people's backgrounds disappear, had flagged something far more interesting than a credentialing gap. Natalie's service record ended in 2016. Just stopped. No retirement paperwork. No discharge. No transition into civilian life. Just a name that appeared in no official roster, no federal database beyond a certain date. That kind of gap usually meant one of 3 things: witness protection, covert operations, or something someone very powerful wanted forgotten. She performed an emergency sternotomy without attending supervision, Caldwell continued, moving through the documentation with the precision of a prosecutor. She endangered the patient with unsanctioned procedures. And now she's been shot while performing duties she had no authorization to perform. Morrison was looking at him with the expression of a man whose day had suddenly acquired several additional layers of complexity. The patient stable. She likely saved his life. She performed procedures outside her scope of practice while simultaneously compromising sterile field protocol and endangering both patient and staff. Caldwell slid the folder across the desk. I need immediate suspension, pending investigation. I need her credentials reviewed. I need someone to contact Naval Medical to understand why her background check came back with 7 years of gaps. Morrison opened the folder. Inside, incident reports Caldwell had fabricated, policy violations Caldwell had invented, a pattern of dangerous improvisation that had never happened but would read convincingly to someone under stress, to someone who'd just endured an active shooter event in his hospital, to someone who needed to believe that someone was taking control of the situation. Morrison signed the suspension papers at 03 for 7 hours, when the adrenaline was starting to wear off and the decision-making part of his brain was still offline. 3 days later, when Natalie was released from the hospital with her left arm in a sling and a discharge summary that cited administrative leave pending investigation, she came home to the apartment where she'd lived quietly for 3 years. Where she'd hidden so thoroughly that the Pentagon couldn't find her. Where she'd built something resembling a life that didn't include explosions or blood or the particular gravity that came from being trained to survive things that weren't survivable. Her daughter Emma was at school. The apartment was empty in a way that felt like an echo. Natalie sat at the kitchen table at 1,347 hours with the termination notice in front of her, formal language, professional tone, the words credentialing irregularities and unsupervised procedures and subject to full investigation by both hospital administration and Naval Medical Center. The words blurred. She wasn't crying. She didn't cry. But something in her chest had stopped responding to commands, something that had learned to survive based on the principle that the next job was the only thing that mattered, and now there was no next job. When Emma came home from school at 1,500 hours, she found her mother exactly as she'd left her. "Mommy, why are you home?" Emma asked, still carrying her backpack, still carrying the small innocent weight of not understanding that the world could simply decide to reject you, that the job that let you disappear could evaporate in the time it took to fire 2 shots. Natalie couldn't answer. She reached out with her functioning arm and pulled her daughter close and held her without speaking, her chin resting on the top of Emma's head, her eyes fixed on the termination notice as if reading it one more time might change the words it contained. The kitchen was silent except for the refrigerator's low hum and the sound of Emma's breathing next to her. Natalie held her daughter without speaking, chin resting on the top of her small head, her eyes fixed on the termination notice as if reading it one more time might change the words it contained. It wouldn't. The words were printed in Times New Roman, clinical and absolute, effective immediately. Suspension pending investigation. Administrative leave. Do not return to premises. 3 days had passed since the surgery. 3 days of morphine drips and physical therapy and the careful removal of bandages that stuck to healing skin. The bullet wounds had been clean exits, the shoulder through soft tissue, the ribs grazing bone but missing anything vital. The surgeon who'd closed her chest had done careful work. "You're lucky," he'd said, and Natalie had not told him that luck was muscle memory, that her body knew how to take damage and keep functioning because it had learned that lesson in places he would never see on a map. She'd been discharged with a sling, discharge papers stapled together, and a follow-up appointment for 2 weeks. The HR representative had met her at the hospital entrance with a cardboard box containing her locker belongings, a spare scrub top, 2 pairs of clogs, a half-empty tube of lip balm, and a patient care manual from 2018. "We'll be in touch regarding the investigation," the HR woman had said, not meeting her eyes. "Your employment status remains suspended." The walk through Cedar Creek Medical's corridors had been a gauntlet of averted gazes. Nurses she'd worked with for 8 years suddenly found urgent business in supply closets. The charge nurse on the ICU had turned away when Natalie passed. Nobody had wanted to look at her. Nobody had wanted to know her. It was as if the attack had made her contagious. Now, sitting at the kitchen table with her daughter pressed against her left side, the injured side, but Natalie didn't pull away, she understood that the worst part wasn't the bullets. The worst part was the silence. The worst part was that her hidden life had been her only life, and someone had taken it. Emma pulled back, looked up at her. "Mommy, why can't you go back to work?" Natalie opened her mouth. Closed it. What could she possibly say? That her boss had tried to destroy her credibility before the shooting. That he'd made 3 phone calls designed to remove her from a place where she'd finally found something that looked like peace. That he'd seen her save a man's life and interpreted it as a protocol violation. That he was so threatened by her competence that he'd built a case against her before the blood had dried on the emergency room floor. But those weren't the words a 9-year-old needed to hear. Those weren't explanations a child could hold. "There was an incident at the hospital," Natalie said carefully. "I'm on leave while they investigate what happened." "Are you in trouble?" The question landed like a punch. Natalie pulled her daughter closer, ignoring the sharp sting in her shoulder. "No, baby. I'm not in trouble." It was the only lie she'd told in 3 days, and it burned in her throat like swallowed glass. That morning, before Emma had found her at the kitchen table, Natalie had received a certified letter. The hospital's legal department, working in concert with administration, had requested her attendance at a formal review hearing in 14 days. They would present evidence of unsafe practice, protocol violations, and inappropriate assumption of authority. She knew exactly what evidence they meant. She'd performed direct cardiac massage through an open chest because Captain Reeves was dying and the surgical team was 60 seconds away. She'd maintained compression rhythm with one hand while her other arm hung useless and bleeding. She'd done what any competent practitioner would do in those 13 seconds of total system failure. Dr. Caldwell had already begun documenting it as recklessness. She'd seen his notes in the chart: nurse performed advanced procedure without attending physician oversight. Concerning precedent for unsupervised high-risk interventions. What he hadn't documented was that she'd saved the man's life. The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, turning everything the color of weak tea. Natalie sat with her daughter's head on her shoulder, the termination notice on the table in front of them, and tried to imagine what came next. She had savings. She had a small house in Pacific Beach, paid off long ago with money from a life that officially didn't exist. She had 8 years of civilian nursing credentials and 8 years of hidden Navy service, and neither one seemed to matter anymore. Emma's breathing deepened. She'd fallen asleep against her mother's good shoulder, her small hands folded in her lap. Natalie didn't move. She sat in the afternoon light and held her daughter and understood, with perfect clarity, that she had 2 choices. She could fade back into invisibility. Find work at a different hospital under a different name. Disappear again, more completely this time. Let Dr. Caldwell win. Or she could stop hiding. The thought was so dangerous, so impossible, that Natalie pushed it away immediately. But it sat there in her chest, heavy as a second heartbeat, waiting. The hospital lobby television played the noon news to no one in particular. The receptionist had changed the channel from the morning talk show, and now a news anchor spoke into the camera with the practiced concern of someone reading about other people's disasters. Caldwell had been heading to a meeting, carrying a coffee cup in one hand and a thin folder in the other, the one he'd assembled to present to the hospital board. The case against Natalie Hayes. The documentation of her incompetence. He passed through the lobby without looking at the television. Then he did look. Then he stopped walking. On screen, a photograph of a younger woman in desert fatigues, face hardened by sun and smoke, weapon at rest across her chest. The Chiron red, decorated combat medic thought dead surfaces in San Diego shooting. The coffee cup slipped from Caldwell's hand. It hit the linoleum floor and shattered, sending brown liquid spreading across white tile like blood in reverse. No one around him moved to clean it up. They were all frozen, watching the screen, because the news anchor was reading names now. Medal citations. Operations classified above top secret. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, believed killed in action during a classified 2016 operation in Tikrit. Pentagon sources confirm that the nurse who saved Captain Marcus Reeves and sustained 2 gunshot wounds while shielding the patient is the same operative who was presumed lost in hostile territory 7 years ago. Her military records were sealed under national security protocols and have been retrieved in the past 4 hours. Caldwell's face had gone the color of old bone. In his office, 15 minutes later, his phone rang. Unknown number. He picked up because he always picked up, and a man's voice, calm, measured, the kind of voice that had learned to deliver bad news with perfect professionalism, said, "Dr. Caldwell, this is going to be the most important phone call you receive today. The private investigator you retained has received a visit from federal personnel requesting that he cease his investigation immediately. Those same personnel suggest that you discontinue any further documentation regarding Master Chief Petty Officer Hayes' employment record. Do you understand?" Caldwell understood. His mouth had gone dry. The folder in his hand suddenly felt radioactive. "The documents you've compiled," the voice continued, "have been flagged as interfering with a classified personnel matter. Continuing to pursue this course will result in federal charges under the Espionage Act. Do you understand?" Caldwell understood perfectly. He understood that he had systematically attacked a decorated Navy operative. He understood that every phone call he'd made, every document he'd compiled, every carefully constructed argument about protocol violations and unsupervised procedures had been filed away by federal agents who did not have a sense of humor about people attacking their own personnel. He understood that he had destroyed himself. The phone went dead. Caldwell stood at his office window and looked out at San Diego stretching below him, the bay, the ships, the city he'd built his reputation in, and realized that reputation was gone. The board wouldn't return his calls. His fraternity brother had already heard something, otherwise the Pentagon wouldn't have moved this fast. The hospital's legal department would soon realize they'd been used as a tool against someone they had absolutely no authority to discipline. He had 2 weeks before it all became public. 2 weeks before the news broke about the administrator who tried to fire a Navy SEAL. No. Not a SEAL. Navy Cross recipients didn't grow on trees. The medal was rarer than that. More dangerous than that. Caldwell sat down at his desk and understood, with the clarity of a man watching his entire future collapse, that he should have left her alone. The hospital lobby television was showing the noon news when Dr. Caldwell walked past the front desk, his posture still carrying the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. He was already composing the narrative in his head, how he'd frame her suspension as a matter of professional standards, how the board would appreciate his vigilance. The anchor's voice stopped him mid-stride. "We're following breaking news out of San Diego this morning. A decorated combat medic thought to have been killed in action 7 years ago has surfaced in connection with last night's armed incident at Cedar Creek Medical Center." The photograph filled the screen. Natalie Hayes. Not in hospital scrubs. Not in civilian clothes. In desert fatigues, body armor visible, her face bronze and lean and absolutely unforgiving. The Chiron scrolled beneath, Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, Navy Medical Corps. Believed KIA Tikrit, 2017. Status, alive. Coffee dropped from Caldwell's hand. It hit the tile floor with the sound of something final, a ceramic cup shattering like all the calculations he'd made in the last 72 hours. His face drained the way a body does when all the blood decides to drain at once. The security guard at the lobby desk, a man named Mitchell who'd served 2 tours in Fallujah, watched Caldwell's expression with the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from understanding exactly what was happening. A man had just realized he had spent 3 days systematically destroying someone whose actual rank and credentials existed on a level he couldn't reach with a phone call and a fraternity connection. The newscast continued. Medal of Valor. Classified operations. 7 confirmed rescues under fire. By 1400 hours, the viral video was climbing. Security camera footage from the vending machine, the audio crystal clear. You might be more comfortable at a VA clinic where standards are more flexible. Caldwell's voice, his tone, his absolute certainty that he was speaking to someone beneath his notice. Then the second angle, him walking past the lobby television, freezing as her photograph appeared, the coffee dropping, his face going white. Just 23 seconds of footage. By midnight, it had 4 million views. The military didn't move the way civilians moved. There was no bureaucratic delay, no chain of email approvals. By 0800 hours the next morning, a Navy commander in dress whites walked directly into Cedar Creek Medical's ICU with the kind of presence that made nurses unconsciously straighten their posture. He was 48, square-jawed, with the bearing of someone who had spent 2 decades in rooms where his word was law. "We're looking for Phantom," he said to the gathered staff, his voice level and carrying the weight of official business. The ICU went quiet in that specific way that hospitals go quiet when authority enters, not emergency quiet, but respect quiet. Natalie's head snapped up from where she'd been collecting the last items from her locker, her hands moving to her sides with the automatic precision of someone whose muscle memory never forgot a parade rest. The commander's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, recognition of rank, of shared language, of a past that no one else in this hospital would ever fully understand. The security guard stepped forward. "Mitchell." His hand moved to his chest in the shape of a salute that wasn't quite a salute. "Sir, that's a Master Chief Petty Officer. You will address her properly." The words hung in the fluorescent air like a bell that had just been rung. Nobody moved. The commander's expression didn't change, but his eye shifted to Natalie with something that looked like profound respect. "Master Chief Hayes, welcome home." Behind him, the elevator doors opened. A 2-star rear admiral emerged, dress whites pressed to knife-edge precision, carrying a file box the color of classified documents. The admiral was 62, with the kind of face that had seen more difficult decisions than most people would encounter in 5 lifetimes. She walked to the center of the ICU and opened the file. Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Marie Hayes, assigned to 3rd Battalion Naval Medical Corps, 2008 to present. Her voice didn't modulate. It didn't perform. It stated facts the way surgeons state diagnoses. Bronze Star for Heroism Under Fire, San Jin Valley, 2011. The first photograph slid out. Natalie at 26, younger, thinner, carrying ammunition for a combat squad through what looked like the worst day of someone's life. Bronze Star for Leadership and Medical Judgment during Operation Inherent Resolve, 2015. Another photograph. Natalie setting a femoral interosseous line on a Marine who'd taken shrapnel through both legs. Purple Heart. The Admiral held the medal in her hand, and the light caught it. Combat Wound, 2016. Grenade fragment, left shoulder. You remained on duty and treated for patients before seeking medical attention. Silence. Real silence. The kind that makes people aware of their own breathing. Navy Cross for Extraordinary Heroism, Tikrit, March 17, 2017. The Admiral's voice didn't crack, but something in it shifted, the subtle change of someone reading about something that had cost lives and changed wars. Solo perimeter defense, for hours, against coordinated hostile fire. Evacuation of 2 wounded Marines and 1 civilian casualty to friendly territory, 6 miles through active combat zone. Estimated hostile force strength, 40 to 50 fighters. Confirmed eliminations, 31. The file box sat open. Inside were photographs of the kind that don't make news broadcasts, Natalie in a firefight stance, blood on her uniform, jaw clenched, moving. Natalie carrying a Marine across her shoulders like he weighed nothing. Natalie walking alone into a wall of bullets and somehow walking back out. The Admiral closed the file. The Navy doesn't lose people like you, Master Chief. We were very glad to find you. In the monitor visible from the nurse's station, in the camera feed from his hospital bed, Captain Marcus Reeves was watching. His chest was healed now, the surgical scar pink and new, his breathing strong and regular. His hand reached for the call button. When the nurse answered, his voice was rough from disuse, from days of sedation, from the physical trauma of having his sternum split open and his heart massaged by hands while bullets flew. "Bring her to me," he said. "The woman in the ICU. Her name is Natalie." She came. Of course she came. Masters Chief don't ignore the direct orders of the people they've saved. She walked to his bedside with the same steady pace that had carried her through Tikrit, through 7 years of hiding in plain sight, through every moment of Dr. Caldwell's contempt. Reeves looked at her, and his eyes filled with tears, the kind of tears that come from understanding something you should have understood a long time ago. "You carried me," he said. His voice sounded like gravel and gratitude. "You carried me 6 miles. And 2 others. We were so heavy and you just carried us." His hand reached toward his forearm, toward the tattoo that had been on his skin since the day he'd woken up in a hospital bed 7 years ago and realized he couldn't remember the face of the woman who saved him, just her name, Hayes, etched on her uniform. "I got it tattooed so I'd never forget. And I was looking at her every day without seeing her. Every single day, I looked right through her." Natalie didn't speak. What was there to say? That she'd never wanted recognition? That hiding had been the point? That she'd saved him because that's what you do, and you don't ask for medals afterward? She simply placed her hand on his shoulder and nodded, the kind of nod that military people understand. Acknowledged. Received. By 1800 hours that evening, the video had reached Johns Hopkins. Dr. Richard Pemberton, 71 years old, chief of cardiac surgery, the man who had written Caldwell's residency recommendation 15 years ago, sat in his home office and watched a 30-second clip of his former student threatening a Navy Cross recipient. Pemberton had operated on 3 presidents. He trained surgeons who would go on to lead medical centers across the country. He had built something. And in 30 seconds, watching Caldwell's voice drip with condescension toward a woman who had held a perimeter alone for 4 hours, Pemberton understood that he had made a mistake in character judgment that would now be his to correct. At 0600 the next morning, he released a public statement. The hospital issued it. The news picked it up. Medical schools across the country included it in ethics curricula by week's end. "I am horrified and ashamed that someone I trained could display such cruelty and disregard for a decorated veteran who sacrificed everything for her country. I formally disavow Dr. Caldwell and any association with his actions. The medical profession is a sacred trust. Master Chief Hayes embodies that trust far more completely than I could have hoped to train." By noon, Caldwell's fraternity brother wasn't returning his calls. By 1400 hours, the hospital board chairman had scheduled an emergency meeting. By 1600 hours, Caldwell sat in a conference room while the board president read the termination notice in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. "Effective immediately, your hospital privileges at Cedar Creek Medical are revoked. You are terminated for cause. Your actions constitute a pattern of harassment and intimidation of hospital staff, specifically targeting a decorated military officer. You are being reported to the California Medical Board for ethics violations. His attempts to fire a Navy Cross recipient. His weaponization of institutional power. His coordinated campaign against a combat veteran. All of it documented. All of it preserved." Within 48 hours, his privileges were revoked across the entire San Diego medical system. Johns Hopkins removed his name from their alumni directory. The private practice his wife's family had built for 30 years asked him to leave. The hospital at which he'd once felt untouchable became a place where he could no longer enter. And then, the detail that would follow him forever, someone made a phone call to San Diego Community College. By the following week, Dr. Caldwell was teaching CPR certification to nursing students at a glass-walled community college facility, making $18 an hour, watching his reflection in the window as he demonstrated chest compressions on a rubber dummy. The dummy had no name. The dummy had no medals. The dummy could not meet his eyes with the quiet certainty of someone who had already survived far worse than any consequence he could imagine. 6 months later, Natalie stood in Cedar Creek Medical's ICU in new scrubs, her title now Assistant Director of Critical Care, her rank finally visible on her employee badge, Master Chief Petty Officer United States Navy Medical Corps. The pair of worn combat boots from Tikrit sat on her office shelf, finally brought out of the closet where they'd been hidden for 7 years. Captain Reeves walked past during his cardiac rehabilitation, his chest healed, his strength returning, his gait growing steadier every week. When he saw her, he didn't look away. He nodded, a nod that carried 7 years of recognition, of gratitude, of finally seeing the person who had always been there. At the nurse's station, the security guard Mitchell taped a photograph to the bulletin board. It showed Natalie in full-dress Navy whites, Navy Cross medal hanging from her neck, her expression focused and proud. In the background, 3 rows deep, you could see Mitchell himself in marine dress blues, saluting. Beside it, he'd written a single sentence, "I knew your face the day you started here, Master Chief. Just didn't know if you wanted to be found." That evening, when Emma came home from school, she found her mother in the small office, looking at the boots. "What are those?" her daughter asked. Natalie knelt, eye level with her 9-year-old, and told her one story. Just one. About Tikrit. About carrying people to safety. About why some heroes hide. About what happens when the world finally stops being loud enough to drown out the truth. The closing shot would have been perfect for a camera, Natalie standing at the ICU window overlooking San Diego, the afternoon light catching the worn leather of the boots reflected in the glass behind her. The rotor wash of a Navy helicopter passed over the medical center, routine, regular, the sound of military business ongoing. She turned back to her team, to the monitors beeping their steady rhythms, to the nurses who now knew exactly who was standing among them. Her voice was quiet, but every person in that unit heard it. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Remember that. She walked back into the unit, finally visible, finally known, finally home in the place where she'd chosen to hide. And this time, no one would ever make her disappear again. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, if you understand the cost of silence and the power of finally being seen, then please subscribe. Like. Comment with your own story of being invisible in plain sight. Because heroes walk among us every single day, and sometimes they're the quietest ones. Sometimes they're already saving lives while the world walks right past them. Thank you for watching.